Okay, well, thanks a lot for having me, even though I'm not an economist, as you will notice in a moment. I'm painfully aware of the fact that I'm the only thing that stands between us and drinking dinner. But I will nevertheless take up my entire hour. And I have to warn you that this is the very first time I've talked about this. So probably not a good idea to talk about something before having done the actual work, but I was tempted by Nuno's invitation and by the topic of this conference, big counterfactual history, which of course raises the question just how big or macro. Now, you can see very big and macro. The reason for this is that we have now spent in history, maybe not so much in econ, but in history, decades trying to decenter and provincialize Europe. And despite all these efforts, Europe remained central to any kind of meaningful debate about modernizing development, the Great Divergence, and so on. Europe tends to still occupy center stage, no matter how much we emphasize and transfers and entanglements and hybridizations and all these things are very fashionable. It's very difficult, maybe impossible, to come up with a truly non-Eurocentric version of world history over the last 500 years. So what about taking Europe out of the story? What if we were to imagine the last 500 years or so without inputs from Europe on other parts of the world, from Western Europe? Now, obviously, this is a very maximal counterfactual that involves maximal violation of very basic counterfactual history rules, such as the minimal rewrite rule, change as little as possible, which is not what I'm doing. Trying to limit counterfactuals to the short term in order to prevent the proliferation of completely uncontrollable second. If my exercise as a result, like fiction, not by coincidence, it has in fact been novelists, even though it's generally suffer from at least two problems, they tend to somehow isn't just by other means. The world somehow turns into a version of what it actually is. And to violate historical plausibilities even more than I hope to do. Example number one would be Kim Stanley Robinson's The Years of Rising Salt, where the kills 90% of all Europeans, but not people in other parts of the world. And what happens as a result of this is that all the things that get invented in history, everything that makes modernity, is invented anyway, the people somewhere else. And you end up with something that's not on our world. Example recently is Laurent Binet, where the Aztecs and Inca were Western Europe in century. So it's just an inverted version of it. Or you have Robert Silverberg's Roma Eterna, where the Roman Empire continues to exist all the way up to the present, but the industrial revolution, all these things happen anyway, somehow. This is not very satisfying. I think that as academics, we can do a little better than this. By, grounding our counterfactuals more seriously in what we know about actual history, and especially in, plausible historical dynamics and probability. I'm therefore quite conservative. It seems very conservative. Actually conservative. I've the principle set out and to seek consistency with well-established historical factualities, consistency with well-established generalizations that transcend what is true at a particular time and place, and consistency with well-established laws of cause and effect. Of course, the result is still fiction, but it's a more controlled version of fiction. I want to proceed in two steps. Step one is to divide of whatever makes sense, and then the actual counterfactual exercise of reimagining the last 500 years or so. I want to focus primarily on state formation, and if there is any time left at the end, maybe 5 minutes, I'd like to talk also about economic development, human flourishing, more generally. Now, the risks in all of this are pretty clear. Two of the most important ones are, to my mind, scope and scale. How can we hope to control these very long-term trends beyond actual history? And the other is the difficulty of predicting genuine things that are very predict vantage point of the past, but which might have made are potentially extremely important, like black that change everything. And of course, we hear because black swan events. But all we can do a test. History 500 years out makes sense at all. And as you will have noticed, it's late, so I'm not going to show text and pictures. That's the most sophisticated text I have. Those are my two stages. The test is trying to take the position of an observer in the year 1000, trying to predict conditions 500 years later in terms of overall trends, dynamics, in state formation. And the second step would be to do the same from 1500 onwards. This exercise serves, the first step serves two purposes. One is, as I said, to give us a sense of how much we can actually hope to predict history 500 years out using conservative assumptions. And the other is that by writing Europe out of the story in the second step, those two exercises actually become very similar because very, very broadly speaking, I hope there are no medievalists in the room, Europe doesn't have a very major impact on other parts of the globe between 1000 and 1500, whereas it certainly does in the second period. So by eliminating Europe from the second period, we make those two stages more comparable in a way. Okay, so assume you are an observer in the year 1000. You can be human or extraterrestrial, doesn't actually make any difference. You know what we now know about history up to that point, and you are familiar with historical methods, theories, dynamics, 500 years out in a deliberately conservative way, drawing on what has happened up to that point and what conditions are in place around the year 1000. Well, let's start with China. In China, around 1000, we are 40 years into the Song dynasty. This is by no means the first time China has been into a very large empire. So in this case, there are some no-brainer predictions to be made. New going to last a few more with pressure from the northern steppe. The conditions are already in place in the previous 1300 years. And there's always a latent risk, again, this is something you know based on earlier Chinese history, of renewed tension, conflict, competition with the imperial center and regional elites that may eventually destabilize or even bring down the questions you wouldn't be able to address from the vantage point of the year 1000 is this democracy going to return? Is China going to move towards a more bureaucratic system? There are some early signals. The examination system being shored up period. I can't really predict just how important it is to become. Absolutely cannot predict in this case the Mongol takeover of all of China in the 13th century because it's never happened before. And so that wouldn't be a conservative prediction to make. What you could predict for 1500 is there are essentially two options. One would be that the Song Empire is still around, or it has been replaced by a comparably sized empire, continuing the whole tradition from Jin to Han to Tang to Song, or there would be some kind of intermediate period of great adaptation. Those would be the two options available. Well, as it turns out, these are really good predictions. By 1500, you have the Song-sized empire in the Ming dynasty. And there is ongoing pressure on the frontier in the same period. Very broadly speaking, not that much has changed. You can't predict, for instance, the Ming turn away from overseas engagement. It was still full swing in the Song period, but in the broadest predictable. Same is true in the case of Japan. You look at Japan around 1000, you see a very considerable degree of regional fragmentation, weakening of central power, great autonomy of regional lords. 500 years, there's back and forth, pushback by the center, pushback by the local lords. But by 1500, that's before Tokugawa shogunate is put in place, it's essentially the same picture. So the more conservative you are, the better you would be at predicting outcome. Southeast Asia, by 1000, state is already in place. For the first time, you have large-scale state formation farther south, the Srivijaya Empire. 500 years later, conditions are actually quite similar. In Korea, the Khmer Empire has been replaced gradually. There's a new Southern Empire, the Majapahit Empire is in the process of falling apart. The only really new thing is the appearance of a Muslim sultanate in what is now Malaysia, entirely from the vantage point of 1000, but still a bit of a novelty. Same is true, in fact, of South Asia. If you're an observer looking at South Asia in the year 1000, again, you have a choice between two major options. One is to predict that some kind of recur in India on the model of the Maurya or Kushan or Gupta Empire, or you're going to predict continuing fragmentation as you find from the late first millennium onwards. Now, the one thing you can't really predict at this point is the scale and intensity and ultimate importance of Muslim-led intrusion from the West. They hadn't quite started yet in the year 1000. You wait another generation, you can already see the Ghaznavid expansion into northern India, followed by the Ghurid of Delhi. But if you wait long enough, if you go up to 1500, well, that different, in fact, from the situation in the year 1000. There's a whole number of several states with smaller intermediate states in between. The Sultanate of Delhi still exists. It's no longer hegemonic power across South Asia. There's a sultanate in Bengal, and of course, against Muslim encroachment with various Hindu or Muslim states in. That's not a situation terribly different. In fact, not very different at all from the situation in the year 1000. Only thing that has changed is religious affiliation in parts of southern India and South Asia. I'm sorry, but in terms of state formation, you get comparable outcome. Same turns out to be true if you look at the Middle East and North Africa region. In the year 1000, there are two major powers, Buyid in Iraq and Iran, the Caliphate, North Egypt and Syria, soon eclipsed by the Seljuk Turkic regime in the course of that century that establishes hegemonic power temporarily in that. And the looks taking over. What we cannot predict in this case is the Crusades. We also cannot predict the Mongols in the 13th century. But it turns out, once you reach 1500, that's not such a big deal, because these are fairly ephemeral kinds of events. Just like the Mongol conquest of China is ultimately kind of event. So yes, there are, but it has a particularly profound, long-lasting impact on nations. So you would miss them, but in missing them, you wouldn't necessarily miss all that much. What about Eastern Europe? Eastern Europe around the year 1000, you have Kievan Rus here with various steppe groups, the Pechenegs and others, to the south and southeast. 500 years later, you have the Grand Duchy of Muscovy. It's a bit farther north than Kievan Rus, but it's a kind of and you have, groups of the south and southeast. What you miss again in this case is Mongol invasions in the 13th century, the hegemony of the Golden Horde. But again, this has already gone away by 100. It's yet another relatively ephemeral kind of outline. What you could have predicted in 1000 Slavic adjacent state formation on an larger scale, because it had already started 1000, and eventually large kingdoms of Poland and Lithuania. Something a conservative observer could already have projected into the future at that point in time. In the year 1000, you get an increasingly Islam-dominated North Christian. Here, you probably already have some of 8,000 policies that we heard about this morning. You have the earliest sign of large-scale state formation in West Africa, in the Western Sahel, the kingdom, which is in today's Ghana, in Mali, in Chad, Accra, in Senegal, and something that continues the next 5 any really major changes in that respect. You still have Islamic polities in the north, you still have Christian Ethiopia, you have larger, somewhat less ephemeral states in West Africa, Kingdom of Mali, the Songhai Empire, into the 16th century. But the predictions are things like state formation here in the southeast, culminating in Great Zimbabwe. Hadn't started yet in the year 1000, already ultimately, it doesn't really stick in a way. It doesn't really have any major long-term influence on that region. And all these outliers, they do occur, not really found change overall. History would have been predictable in the broadest outlines. What about the Americas? Similar kind of situation. Up here. You have a point. I don't have a point. There's a laser pointer. I can at least use the laser pointers and have to jump up that. Thank you very much. You have up here a state in North America that's based on agriculture, on farming in Cahokia outside St. Louis, not yet visible in the year 1000, I guess 50 years later, completely gone in 100. All the various satellite proto-states spawned by Cahokia. America as well, even before the Europeans show up, there is somewhat more maize, there are more people and so on, but no dramatic changes in overall trajectories. Same is true of Central America, without the Toltecs, 200 years later, the Aztec Empire that considers itself to some a successor of the Toltecs. In South America, 1000, the Wari Tiwanaku empires are either falling apart or still going strong. 500 years later, the Inca have taken over the entire region. Again, something not really that hard to predict from the vantage point of the year 1000, because you see a trend of increasing scale in state formation in the Andean region and adjacent area. Finally, what about Europe? The Byzantine Empire undergoes, or Rome, you should actually call it the Roman Empire because they call themselves the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire undergoes a near-death experience in the 7th, 8th centuries. It sort of recovers, but becomes a mid-sized regional state controlling what is now Turkey and the Southern Balkans. Conservative in the year 1000 could say, well, either Roman Empire is going to continue to exist on roughly that scale, or it's going to encounter another existential crisis and will not survive. I don't think anybody would put anything like the original Roman Empire would have been reestablished at Constantinople. That's not a plausible proposition at the time. As it happens, the Roman Empire counted multiple existences. So it's gone. Europe, we all know that Latin Christian Europe around 1000 was a bit of a mess because of the decentralization of power and lordly autonomy and all the various things that everybody in this room knows about. So that makes it more difficult, I think, for our observer in the year 1000 to predict outcomes 500 years out. You could predict the same, that kingdoms will never consolidate. Will be this patchwork of duchies and counties and city-states and bishoprics and all the rest of it. You could predict consolidation. You could, even if you were very ambitious, predict the return of something like the Roman Empire, even though there was no good reason to predict this, because Roman-style governmental infrastructure had really fully disappeared by the year 1000. So that would not have been conservative prediction. Well, as it happens, the first two predictions both came true. Just depends on which parts of Europe you start to see reconsolidation of state power in France and England. You see continuing fragmentation in Germany and Italy, and there's even a shadow of empire still lingering in that part of the world in the form of the Holy Roman Empire of nation. Now, of course, what you couldn't have predicted in the year 1000 do with economic development, human flourishing, the recovery of urbanism, long-distance trade in Europe, unless you were very, well, probably a very conservative observer would have had trouble predicting this. You certainly could not have predicted like death on real wages, all the things that we heard about earlier. But in terms of state formation, the most plausible options on offer, both of them, in a way, came true. But there is one very big exception. Even the most conservative observer in the year 1000 would have made a completely prediction. The prediction would have been that by 1500, Americas would have been incorporated. 1000. There's already a North Canada, right? Greenland is settled about 20 years earlier. North already in place. We only there have been more. No observer knows this. Observer will assume, given 500 years, there will be sustained connectivity between Europe and the Americas. There may be trade, there may be colonization, there may be Christianization, there may be crusades into the Americas, any number of things. Perfectly plausible predictions. And our observer would have been very worried about this. They would have introduced a huge amount of uncertainty into predicting the future, not the entire world, but certainly the future of the Americas and the future of Western Europe. Else would have worried about this for no reason at all, because none of this came to pass. That's a black swan event. Would have predicted, expected to happen, and they expected it to be very significant and disturbing in a way, but it didn't actually come to pass for another 500 years. I have it's by accident. I think the Americans play a very strange role, the role of a spoiler or wild card in any kind of long factual predictions. They're really sort of central to any of the major changes that have occurred in the more recent past, as James pointed out earlier today. But apart from that, 500-year prediction, even close to the year 1000, for most parts of would actually have been quite successful. Now, there are multiple caveats. Again, with the medieval historians, nothing formative anywhere in the world in this particular period. All the major world religions are already in place. There are no really major breakthroughs in terms of science and technology. There are no fundamental shifts in global intercontinental connectivity prior to 1492. So it's easy for a conservative observer to be right, except, of course, for the one mistake that would have been made about the incorporation of the Americas. Now, of course, coming to the second step, an observer in 1500 would have worried about the exact same thing. What is going to happen now that contact with the Americas has been established or reestablished? How will that play out over the next 500 years? That would have been extremely difficult to predict. And more generally, there is no way that any observer in the year 1500 can predict the present in terms of state formation or in any other respect. So the present is completely unpredictable from the vantage point of 1500. That, in a nutshell, seems to be the fault of Europe. So the question is, if we write Europe out of the story, do we make the history of the last 500 years more predictable, if you will? Now, in principle, I don't have to explain how we would get to that point, that there are no European inputs, no European influences on other parts of the world after 1500. It's a thought experiment. So I could just stipulate it, right? We just, write history, Europe out of the story. And that's the way it is. As a historian, it pains me to do that. So I want to spend just a couple minutes on how this might have happened. The novelists haven't really come up with anything good. I mean, it can't be that the Black Death kills 99% of Europeans, but not 99% of people elsewhere. We can't drop an asteroid on Europe because it would devastate the entire planet. But we don't have to do any of these things. We don't have to kill off the Europeans. All we have to do is cause enough disruption to divert Europe away from certain trends that are rooted in the Middle Ages. Now, the only halfway plausible means of doing this that I can think of is stronger Mongol commitment in that particular part of the world. Now, as I argued in my Escape from Rome book, there are many reasons if this wasn't actually going to happen. It doesn't make any sense for the Mongols to do so. Europe is far away. It's far away from the grasslands. It's poor. There are more lucrative areas in China, West Asia. And if the Mongols had tried, they might not have succeeded because Europe is heavily fortified. There are a number of reasons for why this was a really bad idea. For the sake of argument, assume that various great khans throw everything they have upwards, they overrun Europe, they win all the battles, they from treason, they take out all the European states all the way into England. It doesn't matter what happens next. We can't guess what happens next. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is that this could have caused enough disruption project is away from medieval style state society, away from economy, and more importantly, away from state aligned, state sponsored overseas exploration, colonization, and so on. So in other words, away from all the various things that are usually held responsible eventually for divergence. All it takes to take Europe out of the global story, in the sense it will no longer have any massive impact on other parts of the globe. In other circumstances, how would the world have developed? Let me start by the most distant part of the world, Australia. There can be no argument that Europe has had an extraordinarily tremendous impact on Australia in recent centuries. Australia would be completely different without that. In the counterfactual, this doesn't happen. There is no indication, as far as we know, that there are other candidates out there somewhere in Southeast Asia that would have done to Australia what the Europeans did to Australia and the Aboriginal indigenous population over the last few centuries. So we would predict essentially long-term continuity over the next 500 years. Americans are much trickier. because we face a very big choice. This is in the most conservative option, which is to say, well, without the Europeans, there wouldn't be any contact between the Americas and Europe in continued indigenous development across the Americas. What would that have looked like? Well, the Inca Empire was very large. It was already somewhat unstable when the Europeans showed up. This could have been precipitated by the pandemic. It's really hard to control for that. It lasted forever, but if you look at the overall over time, you would expect more large-scale state formation in Western South and Venezuela. In the case of Central America, I'm told by actual experts, that's the empire on its way to becoming a more cohesive, more imperial state. There's another imperial competitor to the west, the Tarascan Empire. People including Arab weapons. So if you leave that region another 500 years, there's a good chance of more sustainable imperial information, greater state capacity, more technology, spillover effects into parts of North America as well. That's, I mean, about as you can take it in the case of the Americas. Of course, the second scenario is to say, well, we could imagine contact and incorporation, even European participation. The three historical options will be available. Option one, of course, is the Mid-Atlantic, Columbus and Company. That would scenario. The second option, the re-establishment of the old Norse route via Iceland and Greenland, would also not be an option in this case, nor be the Russian Bering Sea island chain option. It is only really in the 18th century that would take people from Europe into Alaska and North America. But all is not lost. What other alternatives are available? I think people would generally tend to think first China or Japan. I don't think that's a very promising path to take. There are absolutely no in Chinese history, as far as I'm aware of, that this was ever of interest to anybody. Across the Pacific was a realistic option. It's well known that only goes into Taiwan, conducts one campaign in the Philippines in the 17th century for domestic political reasons to suppress the challenge the Qing dynasty, the Manchu regime in put. China certainly has the capabilities, the assets to project power much more widely into the Pacific, but never chooses to do so. So in our conservative scenario, this would not have changed. Japan is trickier because it's a bit closer to the Americas, has a strong domestic tradition, but it was always within the orbit, the gravitational pull of the mainland, first Korea, and then China. And again, I still have a lot of work to do on that. I'm not aware of any ventures that are gone in the opposite direction. A more promising candidate seems to be the Polynesian option. The Polynesian option is more promising because by 1500, the Polynesians had crossed we now know the entire Pacific Ocean. They settled in Hawaii and the Rapa Nui the islands, only a couple thousand miles away from the Americas. In fact, the study was published 3 years ago, showing, based on DNA data, that around 1200, there was not just contact, but interbreeding, it seems, between Polynesians from the Marquesas area and indigenous people in what is now the Pacific coastal region of Colombia. So contact was certainly made. Given another 500 years, Polynesians certainly had the capabilities logistically to build on that. Was that very likely to happen? I guess not. The final step is a very big step. There are 4,000 kilometers of open sea between Hawaii and the west coast of the US, 3,500 kilometers between Easter Island and Chile. That's a lot of open sea. Not unmanageable, but difficult to establish sustained connectivity over such long distances. And of course, in real history, in actual history, both Hawaii and Easter Island became cut off from the Polynesian network. So not only was there no further eastward expansion, even the most outlying settlements became disconnected from the other. So that's not a very good sign. And maybe most importantly, the Polynesian network by itself was not really well tied into the Asian, Southeast Asian, East Asian networks closer to the continent. So even if the Polynesians had established the connection, there is no guarantee that a more populous party, so to speak, farther west would have bought into that, would have become engaged in these kinds of connections. It seems that by far the one that connects West Africa and what is Guyana and Brazil. It's a short route. It's followed by the trade winds, especially if you go from Africa to South America. Of course, the route later exploited by Portuguese slave traders and so on. Very, very convenient. Conditions are already in place in West Africa would allow that to happen. There is some larger scale state formation, as I said earlier. There's even very famously a story dating from about 1300. The king of Mali built a fleet of 1,000 ships and sailed west the Atlantic, never to come back. We have absolutely no idea if this ever happens. Well, that's not the point. The point is that already in the 14th century, people could think in those terms. Another 500 years, you have big state, Shanghai, empires like the Shokoto Caliphate, late combination with the and again, after homework to find out whether this was logistically feasible, technology available at the time. It could have been over time. You have belligerent bellicose regimes in West Africa. This regime bent on expansion, on enslavement, on conversion, all the things that Europeans practiced in history when they entered the Americas. So it could very happen at some point over the last 500 years. Of course, you have really uncontrollable countries. You have a minimalist version, so all that happens is disease transmission to the world with decimation of the indigenous population. Or else you can have a maximalist scenario where politics from West Africa set up in Brazil, Guyana, Polynesian, maybe slave plantations. That's a form in West Africa. Scenario. So it becomes a completely uncontrollable counterfactual. Again, Americas. So the Americas development is inherently unpredictable from the vantage point of the year 1000 and from the vantage point of 1500. Now, what about, let's go back to cell gas again. We'd see probably more of the same, what we see in actual history, more state formation, larger scale state formation in West Africa, thousands elsewhere. For East Asia is actually very easy to predict because for the most part, Europeans have a very major impact on China prior to the century. Big exception would be the silverization of the Ming economy that's mediated by, the Spanish of the Americas and via the Philippines that shored up the Ming dynasty for a while, but even that couldn't ensure its long-term so it's very likely that the Ming dynasty would have failed. The dynasty suffered the same problem as preceding China center, elite competition, millenarian peasant uprisings in the wake of the 17th century climate crisis, and so on. There's continuing pressure from the north. Most likely the Manchu or a group like them would have invaded China, would they have taken over all of China? We don't know, maybe the northern half, maybe all of it. It ultimately doesn't matter. It's very difficult to imagine fundamentally different outcomes prior to the 19th century, even without any European input. Now, of course, if you look at what the leadership of the People's Republic of China today likes to say, all the bad things that happened to China the fault of, the British in particular, the Opium Wars, all kinds of things. That's true, but it's important to remember that we already see signs of dynastic decay from the end of the 18th century onwards. There are already the telltale signs that we already saw under the Jin and the Han and the Tang and the Ming, multiple times in history going back a couple thousand years of increasing inequality, increased popular unrest, military movements that mobilize the peasantry. And that's exactly what happens from the 1790s onwards. The White Lotus Rebellion, the Miao Rebellion, the 8 Trigrams Rebellion, 1813, that actually almost takes over the Forbidden City. All these dynamics were already underway prior to the First Opium War. You don't need Europeans to destabilize China in that period. Most likely outcome is the eventual demise of the Manchu Empire. If it were still around today, it would be 79 years old, would make it the second longest lasting dynasty in Chinese history. Possible, not very likely. More likely would have fallen apart anyway in the 19th, 20th century. Today, we might experience another phase of imperial consolidation, an intermediate period of greater fragmentation. That's impossible to say, but by and large, a conservative estimate makes the most sense. What about Japan? Well, in Japan, you could say Europeans play a bigger role. It's well known that the shogunate capitalizes on European arms import, and then, of course, imposes the policy of self-isolation, at least in response and Christianity. That's good, but it's worth remembering that Japan could also have obtained firearms from China. Chinese importing firearms from West Asia already in this period. It might have taken a little longer, but it could have reached Japan anyway. And it's also that the policy of isolation wasn't just designed to keep the Europeans out. It was also designed to shore up the power of the new regime, to centralize power, take it away from the lower by cutting off foreign relations. And it follows a model embraced to some extent China earlier, and especially continuously by Korea. And Korea adopts this policy not because of Europeans, but in order to ensure its independence. China. Be that as it may, even some kind of isolation policy or the lack of isolation policy wouldn't have changed very much. As I said earlier, Japan was always the pole of the mainland. It's not this created, trans-Pacific. In terms of state formation, it's hard to say whether fragmentation if return to be a unit. Go to South Asia. This is the situation in the middle of the 18th century. The Mughal Empire emerges without any European input, and it declines late without really significant European inputs. That's a domestic affair of Southeast Asia. You have, as in earlier periods of Indian history, out of South India, pushing back against Islamic regimes based in the Indus and Ganges basins. In this case, the Maratha, this is not an empire, it's a confederation in the Deccan, pushes back against the Mughals in the 18th century. It's true that in real life, Marathas are finished off by a series of wars with the British, but are already signs of internal internal fragmentation, deconsolidation before conflict with Britain occurred, because the Mughal of incentive there is for the regional powers in Central to adhere to that confederation. So you have more and more centrifugal forces already before British intervention reaches a certain scale. You could not predict in this part of the world large-scale consolidation on the scale of the British Raj. There are simply no actors present in the last several hundred years that will accomplish this. I mean, it could have been another resurgence of some Islamic regime in the north trying to take over the entire peninsula, but it's a subcontinent. But the most likely outcome is something like this, where you have more or less large Islamic states in what is now Pakistan, probably more than India, and one or more Hindu-dominated states and another Muslim polity in Bengal, what is now. So, in a sense, it's hard to conceive of significantly. Iran, of course, was never colonized, so we could expect its trajectory to have followed more or less the same path as it in history is called one, which is the Ottoman Sphere. The Ottoman Sphere is difficult to talk about because the Ottoman Empire is so close throughout this 500-year period to Christian Europe. So if you take Europe out of the story, it becomes very, very difficult to say anything sensible about the Ottomans. Maybe there wouldn't even have been an Ottoman Empire. There might have been something similar because you have serial imperial state formation driven by Turkic immigrant groups in this part of the world. So let's assume the Ottoman Empire was like it would have come in this region. Would it might have been more successful, it might have expanded further into Europe, it could have established control over the Union. It could have lasted longer. The empire was only formally abolished 101 years ago. It could still be around today. Or it could have failed earlier because reforms undertaken in the Ottoman Empire and it's taken in response to European pressure. You take this pressure away, maybe the Ottoman Empire would have unraveled even more resistance to reform by conservative constituencies like religious authorities, the Janissaries, and so on. So we just don't know in this case. Now, let me get to my overall conclusion. By and large, the same conservative approach that I adopted for the period from 1000 to 1500 gets us a more of the same scenario for most of the world after 1500 without European inputs, whether we look at Australia or the Pacific or Southeast Asia or Iran or Sub-Saharan Africa and probably also China and India. The only truly unpredictable part of the world, so to speak, is once again the Americas, as it already was in the year 1000. So, in other words, the Europe in the year 1500 would find themselves in the same position in the year 1000, being able to make quite confident predictions about most of the world, but being completely stumped by what was going to happen in the Americas over the next 500 years and what effect this was likely to have on the rest of the world. Now, this wasn't my actual conclusion, because if I can have another 5 minutes, I can say a few words about economic development and human flourishing. Well, I'm not going to take more than 5 because everybody wants to go and have drinks and dinner. Now, my hunch is that if you look at very broad trends in state formation, trajectories tend to be quite robust in the long term. It's very rare to find really sort of dramatic deviations from long-term trends in pre-modern settings. The same need not be true for economic development or technological development, because there's always a higher chance of sort of outlier events, of black swan events that can really change paths of development. Now, needless to say, my counterfactual gets rid, which raises of whether some kind of substitution was likely to have occurred in the form of development arising from other parts of the world, moving in a similar direction. By direction, I mean greater energy capture, enhanced information processing, a shift access societies, increased physical well-being, education, and more generally growing payoffs for more effective understanding and manipulation of the physical universe. Now, these are very different things. As far as open access societies are concerned, I'm not very optimistic about this, because we are basically talking either about agrarian empires one way or another, or the kind of small-scale societies that we heard about this morning. There are just candidates in 1500 sort of ready to enter the narrow corridor, so to speak, ending up with the kinds of open access societies that we observe in parts of the world today and in recent history. Now, as for economic history, I would need another lecture. I would probably need a whole series of lectures to investigate this. And I expect this to be a key element of my project. I should have said this is a long-term project, another one off paper. I really want to look into this more seriously and try to develop these counterfactuals in a more sophisticated way. And of course, economic history will play a central part in this. I haven't done the work yet, so I can only offer a few random thoughts. I think it's fair to say that the literature that seeks to decenter the contribution of Europe in modern economic development often likes to claim three things. Non-European systems were farther ahead than European and of time than used to be assumed. Secondly, Europeans borrow heavily from others in order to do what they do eventually. And thirdly, European intervention in other parts of the world disturbs, aborts, prevents parts of the world. Now, in my counterfactual, we don't have to worry about the first two things because there is no longer any Europe. The third one is relevant only if we could argue that in the absence of negative European inputs, of European interruptions, great divergence level development could plausibly have emerged elsewhere. Now, by common consent, there are only three plausible candidates for this to happen: East Asia, South Asia, and West Asia. So I will limit myself to those three cases. As for China, I can't really see anything that would support this conclusion. Let's assume for the sake of argument, Kenneth Pomerantz is right. It's about the location of coal deposits and the lack of ghost acreages that would hold back China. Well, you don't need Europeans for those conditions to apply. They're independent of European inputs. If, on the other hand, scholars, majority of scholars that point to institutional factors are right or more right, well, those institutions existed anyway. You don't need European intervention for Chinese institutions to be a certain way in the long term. And if institutions somehow interfered with modernizing development, that's not something you can actually relate to European contexts. And thirdly, if there is any merit to the idea, I think there's a lot of merit to the idea, but if there's merit to the idea that some form of productive competitive fragmentation is quite important for laying the foundations for modernizing development, there is no sign in 1500 that China was about to embark on that trajectory. Quite the opposite. The intermediate periods between dynasties had actually gotten shorter over time. So the universal empire in China becomes more consolidated, more stable as time goes by, which of course is a result of, entrenchment and learning over time. So we would need to be able to identify sort of promising signs of homegrown development that would have allowed China to replicate sort of European scale development over the last 500 years. And even without European intervention, I find it very hard to identify such signals. Japan is a bit of a different story. It's often been argued that Tokugawa Japan was, because of its internal conditions, quite sort of well suited to embrace the kind of modernizing development that contact with Europe brought. That may well be true, but it's very different from claiming that this development could have arisen domestically. And again, I need to learn way more about Chinese history in that period to make any statements about this. But for now, this doesn't seem to be a very promising option either. The situation is very similar. Often made that India had a positive contribution to make on British economic industrial development, which is certainly true, and that Britain afterwards had a negative impact on development in India, which is also true. Now, if you take Europe out of the story, what remains to be is that in the absence of Europe interference, there would have been domestic homegrown modernizing development in India itself. And as far as I can see, and I have looked at works that sort of at least implicitly make that claim, like Prasanna Parthasarathis, why Europe grew rich and Asia did not, there isn't really any particularly solid evidence to make us think this was about to happen. So in that case, India and Japan belong in the same category. And as for the Ottoman sphere, I think there's even less reason to believe that any kind of modernizing development was about to occur without European pressure. One could argue conservative constituencies would have been even more powerful. There would have been even less impetus for innovation than in actual history. So in the end, we're left with yet another set of predictions that seem just as conservative as those for state formation. Of course, we have to be very careful because, as I said, in that domain, outliers, unexpected developments, black swan events are perhaps more likely to happen. But if we were looking for a bundle, so to speak, a package of features, which in the case of Western Europe seem to have been foundational to modernizing development, one that combines political, technological, economic, and intellectual factors in a certain way, it's not at all clear that any of those places was on a path, on a trajectory towards developing that kind of package or an equivalent a package, even in the absence of European intervention. Which means that in all likelihood, the maximal counterfactual of a world without Europe would produce a present unrecognizable across the board. Our world would be completely different and much more similar to the way it was 500 years ago. In the end, I think the lesson is simple. There are 3 points. Human development didn't have to turn out the way it did. The novelists that like to assume that somehow all the things that we have today would have emerged anyway, to my mind, are on the wrong track. Recent outcomes are very unpredictable, unexpected. History was much more likely to go on more or less as before over the last 500 years. If we want to understand how big changes come about, we must also think about how they might not have come about. And the final point, explicit counterfactuals, even if they seem wild, like the one that I dealt with here, do have a role to play in this process. I would even go so far as to say that they are vital, they are necessary ingredients for our understanding of the drivers of big change. We can't really hope to get a sense of what these drivers are unless we engage in these big counterfactuals. And so I'm particularly grateful to our hosts to put this conference together. And I hope to work on this much more in the coming years, and would, of course, welcome whatever feedback you might have. And with that, I think we are ready for drinks. Thank you very much.